Good evening. Everybody can hear and see? Great. Good evening. I'm Janet Gornick, Director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. Our center is co-host of this evening's event with the Graduate Center's public program, the Office of Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Welcome to those of you here in the Elabash Recital Hall, and welcome to the online audience as well. For those of you who are not familiar with the Graduate Center, let me just take a moment to tell you who we are and where you are. The Graduate Center is one of 25 schools that make up the City University of New York, and we are New York City's only public research-intensive graduate institution. We host nearly 50 doctoral programs and 18 master's programs, ranging from astrophysics to urban education. We're home to over 3,000 doctoral students and more than 1,700 faculty whose work often crosses traditional academic boundaries, and we hope offering fresh ways to understand the world around us. A key part of the Graduate Center's mission is to promote public-facing scholarship, and it's through public programs such as this one this evening that we bring the excitement of the classroom to the stage. The Stone Center, briefly, is one of 30 research centers here at the Graduate Center. We were launched in 2017, and our work is focused on building and sharing knowledge about the nature, causes, and consequences of economic inequality. Clearly, concerns about high and rising inequality will permeate tonight's discussion. So let me first tell you what to expect this evening. In just a few minutes, our panelists, moderated by Felicia Wong, will discuss this evening's topic for about 50 minutes, and that will take us till just about 7:30 p.m. Starting at 7:30, the panelists will take questions from the audience, and microphones have been placed in the aisles for that purpose. The event will close at 7:45. Tonight's discussion is framed around a large question. Are we on the brink of a new economic order? Specifically, the panel will take up a set of intertwined questions around what is often referred to as post-neoliberalism. Felicia Wong, our moderator, has been known to observe, we're all post-neoliberalists now. She'll pose a series of questions to the panel, including, is that observation correct? And if so, why do we seem to be leaving neoliberalism behind? The panel will reflect on another prominent observation, that is that leaders of both U.S. political parties have been promoting economic and social policies that challenge key tenets of neoliberalism, presumably in order to center the well-being of workers over the power of corporations. This panel will, this evening, sort fact from fiction as they consider where the two parties actually overlap and how and where they diverge. And finally, they'll take up perhaps the most pressing questions of all. Looking forward, what are the prospects for economic change? What is the political path forward? What are the roles of government, the business sector, and civil society? Felicia Wong, a political scientist, is a principal at the Roosevelt Institute, where she served as president and CEO from 2012 to 2025. In a new role, she supports the Institute's current president and CEO, serving as a senior advisor and as a fundraising and external relations principal. In addition to her work at the Roosevelt Institute, Felicia was the U.S. representative on the G7 Economic Resilience Panel in 2021, and she served on the Biden-Harris Transition Advisory Team and as vice chair of the administration's Treasury Advisory Committee for Racial Equity. Her own research focuses on post-neoliberal thought and the intersection of race, economics, and social stratification. Her writing has appeared in many venues, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Review. She is co-author, I just learned this evening, with Dorian, and I also just learned that this book is now banned, called The Hidden Rules of Race, Barriers to an Inclusive Economy, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. This evening, we are delighted to have Felicia back at the Graduate Center, and I say back because she was here, remarkably, in April of 2017, when she moderated a panel called The First 100 Days. Yep.
I must be back.
That's right. Well, at least there won't be a third time, right? Okay. Many changes have unfolded in the subsequent 8 years, and many of those changes will inform this evening's conversation. So welcome to our guest, Felicia. I turn the evening over to you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Is this on? Is this on? Yes, okay, great. Thank you so much, Janet. I have to say, it makes me so happy to hear about the breadth and the depth and the reach of the Graduate Center. It really gives me hope to even just hear you recite what is probably for you boilerplate statistics, but I love it. It's great. Well, it's so nice to be with you all here this evening. Here's what we're going to talk about. Our economy has gone through a series of shocks, radical pivots over the last 5 years. Of course, in 2020 and 2021, we had the COVID shock. In 2021 through 2024, feels like a long time ago now, doesn't it? We had a number of pivots driven by the Biden economic team. They were focused on affirmatively taming corporate power, on boosting the labor market, on actively shaping markets, something we're going to talk about a lot this evening. So that was the second set of shocks or pivots. And then, of course, most recently, we have seen Donald Trump's shocks to both the federal government and global trade, amongst other things. So we have seen a lot of change. How are we supposed to understand this? How is the American public supposed to understand this? Where do different political factions that make up our great country, where do these factions overlap? Where do they diverge? And what does all of this tell us about real prospects for change that, dare I insert something normative here, that is good for the broad American public? What are the real prospects for that? We're going to see effects of tariffs. We're going to see we see tariffs, we see support for unions from younger people. We see anger at corporate greed. We see a whole lot of confusion from the general public and from media. As all of this plays out, it might feel chaotic, and I hope tonight we have a conversation that helps make a little sense of that chaos and perhaps maps a path forward. I am really, really happy to be sharing the stage tonight with old friends and new. We've got 3 amazing panelists here tonight. I will introduce them briefly, and then in their remarks, they will be able to introduce themselves and their backgrounds even more. But to my immediate left, although I'm not sure that's true politically, but to my immediate left, spatially, Chris Hughes, who is an economist and an economic historian, and most recently the author of Market Crafters, which is a terrific book that is rising on the bestseller list. And it's top 2 or 3 on the econ bestsellers list right now. And so Chris will talk broadly, but also about the work in his book. We also have Professor Leslie McCall, who's a presidential professor of sociology and political science at CUNY, here at the Graduate Center. She's also the associate director of the Stone Center, and I'm very excited that she's going to bring her expertise on public opinion about both the history of inequality and the various kinds of inequality and opportunity, and how the public understands that. And then last but definitely not least, we have my friend and co-banned book author Dorian Warren, who is the co-president of Community Change. He is a preeminent labor organizer, movement organizer, and a political scientist who focuses on labor and movement history. So it's going to be a great conversation. Let's get into it. So Janet started this conversation by telling you all that we may or may not be leaving something called the neoliberal era, which is a multisyllabic word that at least my communications folks always tell me not to use because it's alienating and confusing. So let's try to break that down a little bit. Let's ask the question this way. What was the economic common sense, the just the way we thought the economy worked would always work. What was the economic common sense over the last 40 years, which indeed sometimes is called neoliberalism? What was that thing? Are we really emerging from it now? And if so, why do we seem to be leaving that common sense behind? It is also true that I have, trying to be provocative, said that we are all post-neoliberals now, so I'm going to ask these folks whether they think I was right to make that assertion. But first, just really basically, I'm going to start with you, Chris. From an economist's point of view, what was the economic common sense of the last 40 years?
Well, first off, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Felicia. Thank you, CUNY. Let me start answering that question by saying that I think American capitalism right now is in a profound crisis. And it's because that common sense narrative of how markets worked for the past 40 years that many call neoliberalism has broken down. I see us as living through the kind of transitional moment in a political economy that happens every 2 generations. So if we mark it backwards, we're in 2025 now. I think the last time this happened was at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. Before that, the New Deal. Before that, in the Gilded Age. So the gears are really turning, and I think that's why this conversation this evening is so ripe. So neoliberalism is a fancy word for a pretty basic set of ideas. Markets work fine on their own. They're almost like natural organisms. They're self-regulating, they take care of one another. Really, the state only needs to be there to intervene. I call it the famous I word. We all still use it, so we'll see if, at least I, when I recently wrote this book, tried very hard to avoid using that word in the book, but I'd spent years using it, so it doesn't always come naturally.
Because you grew up with this
neoliberalism
idea
is that baked
markets
in.
are a natural
Because
phenomenon.
markets come first, the nanny state comes and intervenes. At best, it's like creating a safety net. That's the metaphor that we use for unemployment insurance. Or it bails out institutions, like banks in an emergency room is the visual that I often have. And it failed. It failed to provide meaningful growth over a long period. It made the economy less equal. Productivity went down compared to historical trends. And Americans don't like it. You know, we had a series of events. First, the great financial crisis, then the challenge of climate change, then the rise of China, then the pandemic. And I think we now live in a moment when Americans are confused about what's going on politically, and they just want their costs to be stable. They want groceries to be reliable, and they want government to actually work. So I do think that neoliberalism as a framework has faded. The last thing I'll say on this is I think this is a cross-partisan set of agreements. You know, in this very fractured time, Bidenomics and a lot of the Biden agenda put the state at the center of the story. We need the state to cultivate markets for clean energy, for competition policy, for infrastructure. And I think Bidenomics actually gets a bad rap. I think it did a lot that was very, very important. But at the same time, what's going on right now with Trump is, you know, incredibly destructive. I mean, it is just unbelievable how many self-inflicted wounds the administration is pursuing, and they still have a narrative of state institutions, particularly on trade policy, but also on antitrust and other things, as being important to achieve their vision, which is very different from my own. So that's why I think this cross-partisan consensus, even though the ends are very different, there's agreement on the means and the narrative that markets need structure. They need to be crafted, in the best of cases, to work well.
So you agree with me? We are all post-neoliberals now.
I think so.
Okay. That's great. Just kidding. Well, I'm not sure that Leslie does agree, so I'm going to go to her next. Leslie, you heard Chris say that Americans are confused about the economy, about the era that we are leaving. From your view as a public opinion scholar, is the public any more confused now than they had been before, and or what does the public think about equality and inequality?
Yeah, thank you very much, Felicia, and thank you. I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone here for participating in this conversation. Yeah, I think I would like to go back a little bit further and ask the question about whether Americans were ever neoliberals to begin with. So I guess in order to be post-neoliberal, do you have to have been neoliberal to begin with? So I want to go back to where we think the origin of neoliberalism was, which was in the 1970s, and then I'll talk a little bit about the crisis. I think maybe Dorian will take a little bit more about the crisis as well, but I'll say a few things about that too. So if we go back and think first about, was there ever a neoliberal consensus among the American public? Because oftentimes we hear that this is something that Americans naturally adhere to. So I want to give one example of a...
Views that businesses
Yes.
are the job creators, that wealth trickles down, et cetera.
Exactly,
Okay.
and actually to use Chris's terminology about intervention, Americans are often said to oppose government intervention in the market, actually use those exact terms to support a neoliberal view that corporate America and political elites and journalistic elites put forward, and then say that Americans, of course, support this because that's the American way of life, right? It's part of American exceptionalism. So I just want to give this really quick example of a public intellectual academic named Daniel Bell, who was very well known and respected in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. And he wrote a book called The Coming of the Post-Industrial Society. And he was very pro-free market. He was an advocate of the free market. He thought that the free market would be fair, and the reason why it would be fair is because it would be rooted in meritocratic principles. It rewarded hard work and talent too, right? And that this was sort of the future as well. And this is very much the era when neoliberalism took off. It was kind of in the mid-70s, and then it really came into fruition, I think, in the 1980s. But the interesting thing about Bell was that he believed in free markets in theory, but he was a major critic of free markets at that time. In the 1970s, this book was published in early 1970s. He was a major critic of the way the market was actually operating in practice. And I mean, at best, you could call him a centrist, right? He was also called a neoconservative and definitely conservative in several respects. And his main criticism was that meritocracy wasn't working, that it was unfair. He even called it unjust, that we lived in an unjust meritocracy. And the main piece of data that he used to support this argument was, this is 50 years ago, remember, was the ratio of CEO to average worker pay, okay? Can anyone guess
What
it was back then?
It was 30 to 1.
Look at that. It was exactly 30 to 1. There you go. And what is it today?
300 to 1.
300 to 1. Wow, this is a very educated audience. There were also other, and he thought this was disastrous. I mean, he thought a 30 to 1 ratio was literally going to completely delegitimize the market economy. There's also public opinion data that supports this, actually. There was a sharp increase in the share of people who said there's a certain question, really the only question that goes back that far in time. It was asked by Harris, are the rich getting richer and are the poor getting poorer? And there was a sharp increase in the share that thought that that was the case also in the early 70s. And there's some other public opinion polls. They're not the greatest in the 70s, but they suggest that there was a lot of criticism coming off perhaps the social movements of the 1960s, and that there was a lot of demands for not only greater inclusiveness and equity by race, by gender, in these movements, but there was also, of course, a lot of criticism of corporations because of their role in destroying the environment too. So we've got to remember, you've also got those kinds of movements that are sparking this. So I'm not sure that you could say that there were ever neoliberals, at least among the public. That these were major issues in the 1970s. And I'll just say real briefly, they surface again in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, with the first white-collar recession, the first jobless recovery in the early 1990s and mid-1990s. And you've also got the proto-populists from the right with Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan. So I think this, there's constant churning here and criticism, I think, that goes back quite a ways. I'm going to leave it there for now. And
Okay,
Yeah.
it's a good answer. You reject the premise of the question, basically. I accept that. Oh, and actually, that's a perfect segue to Dorian. Dorian, Leslie talked a lot about the role that movements have in helping us shape our economic reality. From where you sit, both as a movement scholar and somebody who's knocked a lot of doors, where do you think we are with respect to an economic common sense?
Well, I'll try to pick up maybe where Leslie left off, although maybe I'll start a little bit in the late 70s, early 80s, and say that there were always movement leaders, organizers, activists ringing the alarm about what was wrong with the American economy. And it, in some ways, fun fact, it starts actually in 1963, after the March on Washington, when the organizer of that march, Bayard Rustin, writes an essay in October of '63, thinking out loud about how the Black freedom movement had to take up the issue of political economy, and he was very concerned with automation. So that's not neoliberalism, but there's always been a critique, especially in the Black tradition, of American political economy. Fast forward to, then you get to the 70s, 80s, and the wave, this is one of the puzzles, the wave of newly elected, particularly Black officials and mayors. Think New York, Chicago, LA, each get their first Black mayors in the 80s. They're ringing the alarm about deindustrialization that is happening in those places that is somewhat linked to neoliberalism in terms of trade policy and the encouragement of capital to go to cheaper pastures in terms of labor. Okay, so then that takes us to, I think a key moment is 1994, when we see the emergence of the very first living wage campaign in Baltimore. And that's important.
So this predates some of the Fight for 15 stuff, obviously, by at least a decade, right?
Well, 2 decades.
Right, two
2
decades, sorry.
So the first living,
Yes.
yeah, so
Right.
living wage.
Okay, living wage, 1994 in Baltimore.
And that's important because that's an effort by local activists, because the minimum wage had not been raised. There wasn't. The market crafters didn't intervene, Chris. So they said, we're going to take this into our own hands locally. First living wage ordinance, 1994 in Baltimore, to try to get government to do something that the market wasn't doing and that employers weren't doing. You get 150 more places that do that over the 90s, okay? So that's like local interventions where people have some power because they don't have power federally to try to shape the market. Fast forward to the late 90s, some of us are old enough to remember the battle in Seattle. Do you remember that? That was the pretty big anti-globalization protest, the Teamsters and Turtles, it was called, of people responding to trade policies, to free markets. I think it was a protest around the WTO, the World Trade Organization. I think a couple years later there was a protest against the IMF and World Bank. And that movement momentum gets stopped after 9/11 and the crackdown, frankly, in that period on dissent. But there was still, like at a mass level, there was something else going on. There was resistance to what we might call neoliberalism that elites, at least, had come to a consensus around. Fast forward then to the Great Recession, which I think was one of the major cracks in neoliberalism, which really kind of broke things open. We get the Great Recession. What do we get in 2011? Right down the street here, Occupy Wall Street. Again, a movement moment of resentment, anger around the economic situation of a majority of the people in the country. The year later, surfing off of Occupy, we get the Fight for 15. The effort by SEIU again, started right here, New York City, started right here, of fast food workers to organize to get government intervention into the thing that was not working for them. Over the next decade, you have I can't remember the exact numbers, like over 20 million workers who get a raise, billions of dollars redistributed. These are all mass level attempts to shape the market through government, through power people have at the local level and sometimes at the state level. I might add in the 2010s, and this is leading up to, I think, the current moment. So we have Occupy Wall Street, Fight for 15, the Movement for Black Lives, of which it's often left out. There was a strong economic justice component to that movement, all cresting, I think, in the multi-crisis year of 2020, of which I do think kind of marks, we could argue that marks maybe the end of something and the beginning of something new.
That is such a great laydown, starting with Bayard Rustin and ending with 2020, the pandemic, the election of Joe Biden. That is such a great laydown of all of the ways that we have seen movements pushing to shape not just our economic understanding, but our economic reality. So I really appreciate that. I think it gets to one of the core points of Chris's book, so I'm going to come back to you next, Chris, which is that there are always forces shaping markets. Right? They are not naturally occurring. They respond to many, many different pressures. Now, your book, Chris, is a lot about economic policymakers and the way they shape markets, whether or not we recognize them as doing such. I do want to bring it to this 2020 to 2024 period and the Biden era because, first of all, because it's obviously our most recent history, and also because, I don't know, I kind of think the Biden economic team, I think they're in for a resurgence. I think Bidenomics is going to look pretty good pretty soon. Maybe it already does. But at any rate, Chris, part of your book, Market Crafters, the last 5 chapters, are really about trying to interrogate that era in our economic policy-making history. So I'd like you to tell a story or two. The book is structured around people, 12 different stories about 12 different people who are shaping markets, crafting markets. Tell us a story or two about the Biden era economic changes, and what was so remarkable about them?
Well, I love the stories of people because they're engaging, they're memorable, but I think we can see the historical arcs that both of you are talking about through the experiences of individuals. And so, the book is called Market Crafters, The 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. It's a collection of 12 of these stories of individuals who are in government trying to guide or harness markets for a particular political goal, like making Americans richer, making them safer, making their economic lives more stable. And on this point around the change in paradigm, I ended up spending a few chapters tracking the rise of this of 2 individuals. One is named Brian Deese, who many of you might not have heard of. He was the director of the National Economic Council under Biden, and then Lena Khan. So I'll try to sort of intertwine the 2 of them here, similarly to how I did in the research. So Brian is super interesting because he's a protege of Larry Summers, and is on the Obama campaign in 2008, working with Jason Furman. And this is a crew that generally buys into that neoliberal economic framework. They're left of center. They think we should have strong unemployment insurance and, what they would call a social welfare state. But they generally believe that, markets work just fine and government should get out of the way and just patch things up when they go wrong. So Brian is a student of that. and ends up running the bailout of the auto companies in 2009. So if we remember, after Lehman implodes, the entire financial sector is at risk. AIG is bailed out, but there are all kinds of collateral damage in the crisis, and the big auto manufacturers are at risk of going under, taking hundreds of thousands of jobs, in some estimates, millions, over 1 million jobs with them, and demolishing really important places. So Brian is tasked with stepping up, bailing out those companies.
Remind us how old Brian is when he's saving the auto industry.
Like effectively 12. I mean, he's so young.
I
he's
don't know that
probably,
he's 30. I don't know that
think
he's
he's
30.
30. I
Okay,
think he's
okay.
like in his late 20s.
just
He's
trying to paint the
he's
picture
on
here.
leave from Yale Law School. Everybody thinks I mean, he's a very brilliant guy, but at the time people used the word wonderkind to describe him. So he does that successfully, but it really marks him, because he comes out of it saying, wait a second, if we're going to do these bailouts, we need to place climate standards to make sure that these car companies are, becoming more fuel efficient, and we need to make sure that they are transitioning toward future industries, and so we need to think about how we can shape these markets at the same time as we're helping them in these emergency scenarios. That feeds into his view on climate, and he starts running climate policy in the second half of the Obama administration, where it's not about like a carbon tax. If you remember, that's the old neoclassical idea. If we just price carbon, gas will go up, people won't use it, that will spur, markets will magically come up with energy-friendly products. And Brian's skeptical of that. And he begins to think that there may be a role for public investment and procurement and R&D funding and some of these things. Then you fast forward in the Biden years, he becomes the director of the National Economic Council. And it's a sort of passing of the torch. Larry Summers is now on the outside. And as soon as Brian gets into that seat, he starts doing big things, like ensuring that we have the fastest recovery from a recession that we've ever had. So jobs, of course, went way down in March and April of 2020, and then they shot right back up because we gave it a big boost with a fiscal stimulus. Then he moves on to bipartisan infrastructure. Then it's public investment in climate. Then it's reshoring semiconductor manufacturing. This is a new kind of developmental economics.
Brian is helping to lead both the thinking and the strategy of that
Thinking,
from the White
the
House.
political strategy, okay. He is really the epicenter of the story. And guess who's throwing rocks from the outside? Larry Summers and crew. Because they're worried that their ideology of how political economy should work, how markets should work, is being replaced with a new outlook which says, climate is not just going to solve itself. We can't trust markets to do it, and putting a little gas tax is not going to face the big problem. We have to bring the power of the federal government to invest hundreds of billions, maybe eventually even trillions of dollars, but even that won't be enough. It has to attract private capital. So it's got to be markets and government working together to solve these tools. The last thing that I'll say is all of that work that Brian does about structuring the economy and making it work is what I would largely call a build agenda, and that's paired with balance. So at the same time, over at the Federal Trade Commission, this woman, Lena Khan, who also happened to go to Yale Law School, who was also very young.
happened to be maybe not yet 30.
Very young, comes into power as the chair of the FTC and says, wait a second, antitrust law is important, it exists, it's on the books, and we need to use it to craft markets to make sure that they're competitive. People hadn't been doing that in decades, and she has a very successful run. At the very beginning of her tenure, she and the FTC blocked the NVIDIA ARM chip merger, which comes to be very important in the AI arms race. So that market is still not very competitive, but it's more competitive than it would have been if that hadn't been blocked. She rewrites merger guidelines. She prevents the merger of healthcare companies like Illumina and Grail, grocery companies like Kroger and Albertsons. She ends up winning, the FTC ends up winning under her leadership 90% of the actions that they bring to court when everybody else said it couldn't be done. And so what I'm trying to articulate is that these are individuals who are relatively young, who have a different view that the state can craft markets to make them better, and they are ascendant in the Biden years, and I don't think they're going away, and in fact, I think people like that are the future of what progressive economics should look like.
Well, what I love so far in this conversation is that we've been talking about how markets are shaped from a variety of forces, right? Movement forces, public opinion more generally, and then people who are actually in the seats who get to drive strategy, make decisions. But all of this suggests a picture of markets that are certainly not naturally occurring, and they just happen. So Leslie, I want to turn to you next. Let's stay in the Biden era. I truly want to know, how has the American public understood all of the Biden era changes in the economy? Has it been completely overwhelmed by inflation, or are there other understandings? I see you nodding, so I'm just going to turn the mic over to you.
Yeah, I think it's really tough to beat out inflation. If you look at the kinds of ways that people ask questions about this, they'll ask about, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, what's the most important issue for you in this election or whatever. It doesn't even have to be election related. And the economy is often one of the most important, if not the most important issue that people mention. But within the economy, there are so many different pieces to the economy. And we just simply have not had an era. I mean, going back to the 1970s, that was the last time that inflation was a political and economic issue. And it was really different back then because, sorry to go back in history, I know we're supposed to be talking about the Biden years, but that was the last time that you had high levels of inflation, but it was also high levels of unemployment.
Right.
And so you had what was called stagflation because you had both high levels of unemployment and high levels of inflation. And so those were together seen as a major problem. Whereas in the Biden era, you had this rebound that Chris was talking about from the pandemic, and unemployment was officially very low. There were also trends toward increased earnings and wages for people at the bottom of the distribution. And so there were these seemingly positive things going on, and we had an event about this last fall. And I think that really muddied the picture because those positive trends coupled with these kinds of changes that Chris was talking about, which are, I think, positive changes for workers. And I think even within those policies that Chris was talking about, there were very affirmative directives to support labor, to support racial justice and equity and inclusion. And these were kind of flying under the radar, but they were, I think, part of the Biden vision. And I'll talk a little bit about this more later, but I would overall call this strategy an investment strategy. And investment strategies take a long time to come to fruition, right? Whereas the immediate issue was inflation and prices.
Yeah, I think your point about time frame is very telling. However, I think it has been frustrating to the point of being heartbreaking to those people who worked so hard to actually make sure that a post-COVID recovery was full employment and was pro-union. The idea that there was no political bounce from that, no public opinion bounce, can you help us understand that at all?
Yeah,
I think Chris wants to get in here too after
No,
that.
I was just going to say the thing that is so painful about the inflation is that, at peak it was 9% inflation, and you've got a lot of very centrist economists like Ben Bernanke and Olivier Blanchard saying that at most of that 9%, 2% was caused by the robust spending of the ARP. Right. The inflation actually wasn't even
Peter
related
Orszag said that
to Bidenomics.
6 months ago.
And yet,
it wasn't related to it, right?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but I believe the economists who say that. Certainly it was blamed on the spending of the Biden, that was interesting, Biden. of the Biden policies. But I actually think it wasn't, I just think it was an anti-incumbent. You know, I don't think it was even maybe fully about blaming Biden's programs for inflation, although certainly the media was focused on that. But I think it was an anti-incumbent response as well. And the only other thing I'll add to this is that we forget this, but, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the economy before the pandemic was at a peak. It was at a strong peak before the pandemic. And in fact, there had been very little growth. There was a very long recovery, delayed recovery from the Great Recession. The economy was finally working for working people towards the end of the 2010s. And it hadn't. Actually, the last time, if you look at median income only reached the level that it was in 1999. It only reached that level in the late 2010s again. So we're talking about 20 years, basically, of stagnant wages. So we need to catch up to that. Like, there might have been great things going on in the 2 years of the 2020s, but relative to the long-term trends in earnings and in inequality, I don't think it really made as much of an impression, certainly along with inflation.
The lack of credit for the job market still does puzzle me, but perhaps it always will. But I want to turn to you now, Dorian, because one of, I'll say, my great frustrations, but I think yours too, is that, the economic policy shifts over the last 4 years really never built a mass politics. And that's part of what we're talking about here. So in addition to just public opinion, again, as you lead and help craft and shape mass political movements, what's your instinct about why these in some cases, very revolutionary policy changes did not lead to a mass politics?
Finish that question. Did not lead to a mass politics, ...
Did not lead to a mass politics that supported I don't know, what do you want me, I'm confused. I don't think we've seen, they did not lead to a mass politics to support Brian D. Selena Khan and the team that brought these, no, we certainly have a mass politics in this country. The mass politics is a politics of reaction to all of that. So it didn't lead to a mass politics in support of this economic agenda. Is that what you wanted me to say,
Yes,
Professor?
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So I don't know if I have a good answer, and I'm going to toss this back to Leslie in a second on this, because if you ask Americans or voters policy by policy, I think there's actually pretty strong consensus around a few things. People want government to play a role in their lives and in markets. Or, let me say it differently, if you put things on the ballot for people to vote directly on, the outcome is different than if it goes through the system that we currently have. So I think a lot about Medicaid expansion throughout the 2010s and even into this decade. Pretty popular, both in public opinion, I think, but especially on the ballot. Minimum wage. There was a time 20 years ago when liberals and progressives were a little, gun shy, sorry for that language, to put something on the ballot like the minimum wage. Like, we weren't sure if we should do that. And that was in a moment when, anti-gay marriage bans were on the ballot, too. So, but 20 years later, you put minimum wage on the ballot, it's going to overwhelmingly win. Medicaid's going to overwhelmingly win.
In red places and blue places.
Exactly. Right. So there is something going on, I think, both in terms of our political system and especially in the media ecosystem that helps explain the disjuncture between the outcomes, say, in Washington, D.C., or, say, last election day, versus where people are in terms of their attitudes and their actual behavior. The other thing I'll just point out, just to go back to the previous question a little bit, Felicia, it's not lost on me. there were two other big wins. Maybe this is also related to some of what you were saying, Chris. There were two sort of big wins in the 2010s around the role of government that I don't want us to forget. One is the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which has increased greatly the role of government in terms of healthcare and the delivery of healthcare. And this, again, and then that opened the door for Medicaid expansions, of which, over 70 some odd million, close to 80 million people rely on Medicaid for healthcare. The other example is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We created a whole new big agency to be the cops on the beat for Wall Street and big banks. That is government intervention, and I think that pairs nicely with the Lena Khan story in terms of the development and the establishment of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as something that, right, it is market crafting in a sense, to use your term, Chris, and you should say more about it. So I don't want to lose that thread, because that also tells me that the neoliberal consensus had long been broken. Even in the 2010s, if we're standing up brand new agencies to do regulation and enforcement.
So you're on team, Leslie, that we were never neoliberal, and so this whole okay, all right. I'm still trying to take the collective temperature here. Okay. Chris, did you?
Depends on who you're talking about.
Leslie,
Can I
did you
just
want to add something? Yes, please.
One thing, because what's really interesting, because the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau came out of Dodd-Frank. Right. And what was something that I followed, really big part of Dodd-Frank, was actually disclosing executive pay and worker pay, which took a very long time to actually implement, right? Because these things get passed, but whether or not they actually get implemented is another question. So that was already high on the agenda. Yes. And there was a lot of resistance, a lot of corporate resistance to actually disclosing that kind of information. But that's pre-Occupy Wall Street.
Right.
You know.
Okay, so we are going to leave the Biden era, because we in fact have left the Biden era. We got to talk about today and what is happening in the economy now. We are on, is it day 101? We're on day 101? Okay, all right. And so, Chris, you made the argument, I agree with it, that the Trump administration is in many important ways post-neoliberal. They're also sort of zombie market, market über alles. There's a little bit of that going on too, a lot of that going on actually. But I'd like you to just help us make sense of what in the world is going on in the Trump macroeconomy. Both with respect to tariffs, yes, okay, but also the larger drivers of global financial uncertainty. Like, how do you wake up every morning and read the Financial Times? How do you even understand what you're seeing in the mornings?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd say two things. The first is, people have been asking me over the past couple of weeks, is Trump a market crafter? And a couple people have said, well, I think it's better to think of him as a market crasher, because he and the team are bludgeoning markets. I mean, their policies have caused equity markets to go down significantly. Consumer sentiment is now at the lowest point as it's been since like April of 2020, when we were all locked up in our houses panicking about everything, our health, the economy, our country. Investor uncertainty is up. And then maybe most worrisome in the long term is that globally, I think people are reevaluating whether American assets of all sorts are a good and important bet. So I guess the first thing that I want to say is, I do think that the Trump folks, in their policies, want to use government policy to pursue their ends. Now, their ends are vague. Like, I don't know if anyone, maybe we can do this in the Q&A, but like, what is the point of the tariffs? Bring back jobs. Okay, so why are we tariffing avocados? Or blueberries? Or why would you do an across-the-board tariff if it's like, is it manufacturing jobs? Is it for autos? So why would we have 25%? It just is.
Is it a national security argument? Is it a revenue argument?
It's all of them and none of them, and it's very elusive. And
That's a polite way to put it.
Yeah, it is. But my point is like, they are using a lot of the tools that, would have been absolutely verboten in the George W. Bush, in every Republican administration, really going back, except for maybe Nixon. And yet they're still not using them to craft markets. It seems like we're just riding at the whim of what Trump wants this week. So the second thing that I would say is I do think that things are going to get much worse, unfortunately, economically. I think that, we got the first quarter GDP data in today already showing economic contraction in the country. Most analysts and economists predict that a recession will be in recession this year. That will mean rising unemployment. At the same time, consumer short-term inflation expectations are up again, well over, they think over 4% for, I think, the 7 to 10 year, and even higher for the short term. And so the Fed, normally in these kinds of recessionary moments, is going to loosen monetary policy. There's the basic counter-cyclical Keynesian set of ideas to cushion, but they can't. Or they think they can't, if inflation is still so high, because it's that stagflation concern. So if that wasn't bad enough, the size of the tax bill, the tax cut, is enormous, folks. So already we're running high deficits. Last year our deficit was 7% of GDP in a pretty healthy economy. That's very high, historically speaking. And now the size of their bill is the size of the first Trump term tax cut, plus all of the COVID stimulus, plus the bipartisan infrastructure law combined. In a moment when we already have very high deficits and bond markets freaking out.
Adding.
Meaningfully adding to the deficit. And so, and then finally I'll say that the real threat, and I think what many investors are worried about, is that the institutions of American capitalism could be compromised. So if the president can fire the Fed chair and the rest of the board of governors, then that could lead to a chronic inflation, making all those bonds, the tens of trillions of bonds out there, worth significantly less, which investors don't want. And then there are even more experimental ideas. I mean, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors has written about potentially not paying the coupon on certain government debt if it's owned by the Chinese.
Help us understand what that
so
means.
You have $100 of debt, the Treasury's going to pay you, 3% every year, not if you're in China. So they'll say, some of our debt we're not going to pay. Whose debt? And who else is... How will you do that? I mean, there are ways to do this. There's some historical precedent in the Second World War, but this is serious stuff. And talk about a kind of crisis of confidence. So I say all that because, I think in my book, I think a lot about the collapse of Bretton Woods and the gold standard in 1973 and some of the responses to it when there was fear of the dollar no longer being the reserve currency and a run occurring. It feels very similar to me, except the difference is it used to be gold that was the anchor of the system, and today it's trust in American institutions. And if those dissolve, then the economic challenges could be very bleak.
So Leslie, you heard Chris describe a remarkable 101 days. How is the American public understanding what is happening?
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious there. We're getting some pretty high-quality polls now, and they're all saying the same thing. People are opposed to 95% of what is being done by the Trump administration. I think the one issue in which you're only at around 50% support, approve, or oppose is some of the immigration issues. But even on those, there's some evidence that people think that he's gone too far.
For example, on the Abrego Garcia case? Or, I mean, some of the specific...
Yes, definitely some specific cases, too. One thing I want to raise, because I think this is related to our topic here, but, the massive downsizing of government, I mean, isn't that neoliberalism?
Which government is getting... There are more government workers now than when Doge started. Government hiring overall is up. The narrative is... cuts.
So slashing certain kinds of programs right? That
Yeah.
are not, that are seen as strengthening the opposition party, right? But I think it also goes towards certain kinds of regulatory policies. I know certain regulatory policies are being supported, right? Because we know that some of the work that Lena Khan did is also supported now by the Trump administration, right? So there's some of that. But I mean, going way back to where we started, part of neoliberalism was the opposition to labor regulations, to anti-discrimination regulations, to affirmative action, to preventing policies like universal child care, health care, things like that that would support workers, right? That's part of neoliberalism, and I don't see any of that going away. I see that only intensifying. So I guess that's my sort of more, my observation about these kinds of policies and whether or not we're in a post-neoliberal era rather than sort of people's response to it. I think it's pretty clear that we're seeing a lot of opposition finally coming.
I do think there are a lot of truly zombie renditions of some neoliberal ideas that even Friedman would, probably raise an eyebrow at. But yes, you are definitely right about some of these policies. And I also think many of the polls we've seen recently showing widespread opposition, and then many of the focus groups show anger and, buyer's remorse. Anyway, they're clearly something is breaking through.
But are we seeing an interest in free trade? I think that's why I started talking about, I think I feel confused half the time, because I think Americans, I see that same skepticism of the tariffs, cross-partisan sentiment, and yet I don't think people are like, wow, we got to get back to that free trade. That was working great either. And so it's a little bit, I think that's the definition of a political opening, is when people are like, well, then what is it going to be?
Well,
That's what I mean by them never originally being neoliberal, though. Like, there never was a really strong free trade orientation, at least among the public, I would say.
So, with that, I'd like to thank Dorian, Leslie, Chris, the entire team here at the Graduate Center, especially Janet, and thank you all for sharing your evening with us. Please go out and pay attention to each other and to our democracy. Thank you.